When insult rose in the room, Arvind Krishna's simple words changed. Sundar Pichai's heart. The hall was silent at first. It was one of those halls where the air feels heavy, where every whisper could be heard, and where every eye is searching for a moment to remember. Leaders from across the world had gathered for an event, people with power, with respect, with influence. The audience sat in neat rows, their faces half lit by the bright lights above, their attention sharp and restless. Then, it happened. An insult. It rose not like a whisper, but like a sudden wave that crashes without warning. A man in the crowd, with a voice filled with pride and bitterness, spoke words aimed at Arvind Krishna. The sound carried through the hall like a strike of thunder. People turned, shocked by the harshness. Some faces showed curiosity, others confusion. A few even smiled, hungry for drama. Arvind Krishna stood there, calm. His presence was gentle, his eyes soft but steady. He did not rush to defend himself. He did not let anger paint his face. He simply looked at the man, and in that silence, the whole hall leaned forward. Many expected an argument, a counterattack, maybe even an explosion of words. But none of that came. Instead, Arvind breathed in slowly. He let the insult sink into the space around him without letting it pierce his heart. Inside him, there was no storm, only a quiet strength. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost tender, yet it carried across the entire room. When someone throws anger, Arvind said softly, I see pain hiding behind it. I do not feel smaller because of it. Instead, I ask myself what wound made this person speak like that. The hall froze. Those were not words of defense. They were words of understanding. Not a shield, not a sword, but an open hand. Sundar Pichai, seated at the front, lifted his eyes slowly toward Arvind. He had seen arrogance, he had seen pride, but this was different. Sundar's heart, usually calm and balanced, felt an unexpected shake. It was as if someone had gently touched a place deep inside him that he had kept guarded. The man who had insulted Arvind shifted uncomfortably. His face, once firm and bold, softened into confusion. He had not expected humility. He had not expected kindness. The power of Arvind's words did not crush him. It held up a mirror, and the audience felt it too. A sudden quiet respect grew in the hall. It was not forced. It was not demanded. It simply appeared, carried by the simplicity of Arvind's answer. Sundar leaned back in his chair, his thoughts racing. He had faced insults in his life. He had learned to stay calm, to stay strategic. But deep down, there were times he had carried the wounds silently. Times when he had let sharp words leave marks inside him. Now, as he watched Arvind, something stirred. It was not just admiration. It was reflection. He asked himself silently, have I been carrying hurt when I could have been carrying understanding instead? Narendra Modi, seated nearby, kept his eyes on Arvind as well. The Prime Minister was known for his strength, his presence, his ability to command respect. But even he tilted his head slightly, almost as if he too was listening, not just with his ears, but with his heart. In that moment, the insult that had once filled the room with tension became smaller, weaker, almost meaningless. The hall no longer held the weight of humiliation, but the lightness of unexpected grace. Then Arvind added, we all meet moments when words try to break us. But no word can define us unless we accept it. We are not shaped by insult. We are shaped by how we choose to respond. Those words sank into the silence like seeds dropped into soil. No one moved. No one wanted to break the spell. Sundar's fingers tapped against his chair, a habit when he was lost in thought. He remembered the long path of his life, the challenges, the people who had doubted him. So many times he had smiled on the outside, while inside he carried a weight. Now he wondered if true strength was not just endurance, but letting go of the poison before it touched the heart. The hall began to breathe again. Some people clapped softly, unsure if clapping was enough. Others simply nodded, their faces showing quiet respect. But what stayed with everyone was not the insult, not the tension, but the way Arvind had answered. And Sundar knew, deep inside, that something had shifted. He was not sure yet what it meant, but he felt it clearly. Arvind's simple words had touched something deep in him, something he could not ignore. This was only the beginning. The silence after the storm. The hall was still echoing with the weight of Arvind Krishna's words. The man who had hurled the insult shifted nervously in his seat. His shoulders, once raised in pride, now looked heavy. He kept his eyes down as if he feared that looking up would show too much of his own weakness. The audience was no longer watching him. They were watching Arvind, and more quietly, they were watching Sundar Pichai. Sundar sat with his hands folded, his gaze fixed on Arvind. He had spent years mastering the art of calm leadership, but now he felt like a student again. The humility that Arvind showed had pierced through the layers of control Sundar had always kept around himself. For the first time in years, Sundar felt a stirring of vulnerability. It was not weakness. It was a reminder that strength could look different than what he had always believed. Sundar remembered a moment from his own life. He was younger then, standing in a small room full of people who doubted him. One man had told him that he would never rise to anything meaningful, that he was too simple, too quiet, too unremarkable. Sundar had smiled politely that day, but inside he carried the sting for years. Every achievement he earned afterward felt like a silent answer to that insult. But had he ever really let it go? Or had he let it live quietly in the back of his mind, feeding his drive, but also draining his peace? Arvind's words echoed inside him. We are not shaped by insult. We are shaped by how we choose to respond. Those words struck Sundar in a way nothing else had. He realized that he had been carrying his old insults as fuel, but not as lessons. He had fought them, but he had not released them. Arvind, in one simple moment, had shown him that real freedom was not to fight insult, but to rise above it so gently that the insult itself loses its power. The hall began to settle again. The event was supposed to continue. Speeches and discussions lined up one after another, but for a few minutes no one wanted to move forward. It was as if the entire room was caught in a deep pause, reflecting silently on what they had just witnessed. Then Narendra Modi leaned forward. His presence had always carried weight, but in that moment, his voice was quieter than expected. Strength, he said slowly, is not shown by the volume of our reply, but by the depth of our heart. The audience turned their eyes toward him, surprised at his gentle tone. Sundar turned too, studying Modi carefully. He saw something rare in his expression, an acknowledgement, almost as if the Prime Minister himself had been touched by Arvind's response. Arvind simply bowed his head slightly, acknowledging Modi's words without claiming any pride. His calmness did not waver, and that calmness itself felt like a shield that no insult could ever break. But inside Sundar, something more was happening. He felt a quiet storm of questions. Have I been leading with calmness only on the outside? Have I forgotten the power of softness on the inside? Have I mistaken silence for peace when it was sometimes only restraint? He did not speak, but his silence was not empty. It was full of reflection. A sudden twist came when the man who had spoken. The insult finally stood up. His face was pale, his hands trembled slightly. The audience turned to him again, expecting perhaps another burst of pride, another harsh comment. But instead, his voice shook. I spoke out of turn, he said quietly. I thought strength was in shouting, But I see now it was weakness. Forgive me. Gasps spread through the hall. It was rare to see someone admit fault in front of such a crowd, but the moment felt raw, honest. It was as if Arvind's humility had not only softened Sundar's heart, but even reached the man who had been the source of the insult. Arvind's response was simple. There is nothing to forgive. We all speak from the place we are standing. Today, you showed courage by standing in a new place. The hall erupted in soft applause. Not thunderous, not forced, but sincere. The kind that carries respect instead of excitement. Sundar's chest tightened. It was a moment he would never forget. Humility had not only diffused insult, it had transformed it into respect. And in that transformation, Sundar realized, lay a lesson he had needed all along. He did not know it yet, but this moment would change the way he looked at his own journey, his own leadership, and even his own heart. This was not just Arvind's story anymore. It was slowly becoming Sundar's story, too. Sundar's quiet storm, when the hall settled after the apology, the event continued. Speakers rose, voices filled the air again, and the program moved forward as if nothing unusual had happened. But inside Sundar Pichai, the silence from Arvind's words did not leave. It stayed with him like a shadow that followed every sound, every clap, every movement in the room. He tried to focus on the speeches. Numbers were shared, strategies discussed, visions painted for the future. Sundar was used to this. It was his world: technology, progress, leadership. But that evening, his mind was not on the stage. It was pulled back again and again to that one moment when Arvind had stood calm against insult, when humility had defeated pride without force. Sundar's fingers tightened around his notebook. He remembered how he had once handled moments of insult. He had smiled politely, remained silent, and then gone back to work with a quiet determination to prove people wrong. But proving people wrong, he realized now, was never the same as freeing yourself from their words. One was a battle of ego. The other was a release of the heart. He leaned back, his thoughts drifting years into the past. He saw himself as a young boy in India, sitting in a small classroom. A teacher had once looked at him and said, "You are too quiet, Sundar. In this world, quiet boys get left behind." Those words had burned inside him, pushing him to rise, to lead, to show the world that even quiet voices could be powerful. But even as he climbed higher, even as he became a leader known across the globe, those words had never truly left him. They lived inside him like echoes. Now, hearing Arvind, he wondered if maybe the real strength was not to fight those echoes, but to let them dissolve completely. Maybe quiet was not weakness. Maybe humility was not fragility. Maybe it was power. In its purest form, the audience clapped for the next speaker, and Sundar clapped too, but his mind was far away. He glanced at Arvind, who sat calmly as if the earlier storm had never happened. Arvind's face was steady, his shoulders relaxed, his eyes peaceful. There was no trace of pride, no trace of victory. It was as if he had not won anything, only lived his truth. Sundar felt a storm building inside. Questions began to pour in. Have I lived my truth, or have I lived my defense? How many times have I hidden behind achievements just to silence doubts that were never mine to carry? Narendra. Modi noticed Sundar's stillness. He leaned slightly toward him and spoke in a low voice, almost like a whisper. "You are thinking deeply," he said. Sundar turned his head slowly. "Yes," he replied, his voice even softer. "I am realizing that maybe I have carried more than I needed to." Modi gave a small nod. "The hardest journey is not upward," he said. "It is inward." The words sank into Sundar like stones into water. He nodded gently, his eyes returning to Arvind. There was a new respect there, a respect that went beyond professional admiration. It was the respect of one human being learning from another, not because of power, not because of status, but because of truth. Sundar knew something had begun inside him. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was quiet, like a seed breaking, open under the soil. No one could see it yet, but it was there, and it was real. Later, as the evening drew on, the audience left in groups, their conversations filled with the day's speeches. Some spoke of policies, some of visions, some of future opportunities. But many, quietly, kept returning to that single moment, the insult and the way it was answered. It had left an impression that no chart, no statistic, no headline could match. And Sundar, walking slowly out of the hall, felt a weight he had carried for years begin to lift, though not completely. It was the start of something, a quiet storm, that promised to change him in ways he had not yet imagined. Testing the lesson the night after the event, Sundar Pichai returned to his hotel room. The city lights shone outside his window, scattered like stars fallen to the ground. He sat in silence, staring at them, but his mind was not on the city. It was still trapped inside the hall, replaying every word that Arvind Krishna had spoken. His phone buzzed with messages, emails from work, updates from his team, reminders of meetings. He glanced at them but did not answer. His thoughts were heavier than his responsibilities that night. He remembered the man who had insulted Arvind. He remembered how Arvind did not fight back, how he had chosen to understand instead of attack. It was a picture that would not leave Sundar's mind. He asked himself a question he had never asked before. What if I had been the one insulted that night? What would I have done? He knew the answer. He would have smiled, remained silent, and later he would have let the insult fuel him. He would have worked harder, spoken stronger, achieved more, only to show that he could not be dismissed. But now, as he thought about it, he realized that even in victory, the insult would have owned him. It would have lived inside his success, hidden but alive. That realization shook him. He whispered to himself, "Maybe I was never as free as I thought." The next day, Sundar had to attend another gathering, smaller but equally important. Leaders sat around a circular table discussing plans for the future. The mood was polite but tense, as it often was when powerful minds tried to share the same space. During the discussion, one of the participants, a man with sharp eyes and an impatient tone, interrupted Sundar. "With all respect," he said, though his voice carried little respect, "your approach is too soft. The world does not move forward with softness. It moves forward with boldness and command." The room fell quiet for a moment. All eyes turned to Sundar. It was a challenge. Not as harsh as the insult Arvind had faced, but sharp enough to cut into the air. For a brief moment, Sundar felt his old habits rise. He wanted to defend himself, to remind the man of his achievements, to show that softness had not stopped him from leading one of the world's greatest companies. He wanted to prove, as he always had. But then Arvind's voice returned in his mind. "We are not shaped by insult. We are shaped by how we choose to respond." Sundar breathed in slowly. Instead of fighting, instead of defending, he let silence rest for a moment. Then he spoke calmly. "Sometimes," he said, "softness is not weakness. Water is soft, but it carves through stone. Humility is soft, but it can change a heart faster than force ever could." The room grew still. No one expected that answer. Some tilted their heads, some leaned back, but everyone listened. The man who had challenged him narrowed his eyes but said nothing more. His silence was not agreement, but it was respect. Sundar had not defended his ego. He had offered a truth. Inside Sundar's heart, he felt something unusual. It was not pride, not the satisfaction of winning an argument. It was lighter. It was peace. He realized that by choosing calmness, he had freed himself from the need to prove anything at all. Later, as the meeting ended, one of the younger leaders approached him quietly. "Your words, they made me think," she said. "I always thought kindness made me look small. But today, you made it feel strong." Sundar smiled softly. It was a small comment, but it touched him. He realized that humility was not just personal. It was contagious. It spread like light in a dark room, reaching hearts that did not even know they needed it. Walking back that evening, Sundar felt a new strength rising. It was not the strength of achievement, not the strength of being right, but the strength of being true. And yet, deep inside, he also felt fear. This path was new. It was not the path of proving. It was the path of letting go. And letting go, he realized, could be harder than holding on. The true test days passed, and the memory of Arvind's words stayed alive in Sundar's heart. He found himself reflecting at unexpected times, while reading reports, while listening to colleagues, even while walking alone. The idea of humility as strength had settled into him like a quiet flame, glowing softly, reshaping his view of the world. But one evening, that flame was tested. It was during a private roundtable with leaders from different nations and companies. The atmosphere was tense, heavier than usual, because the discussions involved not only technology, but politics, economics, and pride. Voices were sharp, arguments collided, and the balance of respect was fragile. Sundar spoke calmly about cooperation and understanding, about building bridges rather than walls. Most listened politely, but then, without warning, a senior official from another delegation leaned forward. His voice was cold, and his words were sharp as a blade. "You talk of humility and cooperation," the man said, "but people like you hide behind soft words while real leaders take bold steps. You are not strong. You are convenient." The words struck like lightning. The room gasped. Some lowered their eyes, waiting for Sundar's reply. Others watched eagerly, expecting anger, expecting defense. It was the perfect stage for a clash. Inside Sundar, his old self stirred. The part of him that had always wanted to prove, to silence critics with success and power, pushed forward. He could have listed his achievements, spoken of his journey, reminded everyone of the empire he led. He could have crushed the insult with facts. But then, like a whisper cutting through the storm, Arvind's words returned to him. "We are not shaped by insult. We are shaped by how we choose to respond." Sundar closed his eyes for a brief second. When he opened them, his gaze was steady. He spoke with a voice calm and clear. "Strength is not only in bold steps," he said. "Strength is also in knowing when not to crush another. Power can build fear, but only humility can build trust, and trust lasts longer than fear." The room fell silent. The words were simple, but they carried a weight no argument could deny. The man who had insulted him pressed his lips tightly, as if ready to fire back. But something in Sundar's tone stopped him. It was not the voice of someone defending himself. It was the voice of someone speaking truth without fear. And in that silence, Narendra Modi, who had been quietly watching, finally spoke. "History does not remember those who shouted the loudest," he said softly. "It remembers those who brought light when darkness was expected. Sundar has chosen light." The tension in the room broke. The audience shifted, some nodding in quiet agreement. Sundar felt his chest rise and fall with relief, not because he had won, but because he had stayed true. Later, after the meeting ended, Arvind approached him. There was no long speech, no grand advice. He simply placed a hand on Sundar's shoulder and said, "You chose peace when war was offered. That is harder than leading a company. That is, leading yourself." Sundar felt the words settle deep inside. For the first time in many years, he realized he had faced insult without letting it own him. And in that moment, He understood. The true test of humility is not in small moments, but in the moments when the whole world watches. He walked out into the night, the air cool against his face. The city lights no longer looked like distractions. They looked like reminders that even the smallest light could shine through the heaviest darkness. The turning of hearts, the next morning the grand hall filled again. The final sessions of the gathering were about to begin, and the atmosphere was electric. Everyone had heard about what happened the night before. Whispers moved through the corridors. Stories were retold with different colors, but one detail remained the same. Sundar Pichai had answered insult with calmness that stunned even the harshest critics. People expected the last day to be filled with tension. They expected rivalries, clashes of words, and shows of power. But instead there was an unusual quietness in the air, as if something had shifted. Eyes that once searched for conflict now carried curiosity. Hearts that had come ready to argue now carried caution. When Sundar entered, many heads turned. He walked with the same soft steps as always, but this time there was something different. It was not authority that made people notice him. It was presence. His silence was no longer empty. It was full, like a river flowing beneath calm water. The first sessions went on, filled with usual speeches and presentations, but the air seemed heavy with waiting. And then, as if fate had chosen its moment, another voice rose in challenge. A delegate from the far side of the room stood up, his words sharp. "Humility may sound noble," he said, "but in a world of competition, humility is weakness. Cooperation is a dream, but power is real. If we do not fight for dominance, we will be swallowed." The words cut through the hall, stronger than any applause. Many looked at Sundar, expecting him to answer. Some waited for anger, some for defense. The air grew tight, every breath holding suspense. Sundar stood slowly. He looked around the hall, his eyes meeting the eyes of those watching him. He did not rush. He let the silence grow until the room leaned into his stillness. Then he spoke, each word clear, steady, and soft. "I was told once that softness cannot change stone," he said, "but water proves that wrong every day. I was told once that insults define us, but I learned they only define the one who speaks, them. And I was told that humility is weakness, but last night, humility turned an insult into respect. What greater strength is there than that?" The hall froze. The delegate who had spoken remained standing, but his expression softened. He had expected a clash, but he had received a mirror instead. Then something unexpected happened. Arvind Krishna, who had been sitting quietly all morning, rose to his feet. He placed his hand over his chest and said in a steady voice, "Humility is not weakness. It is courage without weapons. It is light in a room that expects darkness. Sundar has shown us that." The audience gasped softly. It was unusual to hear such open acknowledgement, especially in a hall filled with leaders. But before anyone could react further, Narendra Modi also rose. His voice carried power, but this time it carried something more: admiration. "Leaders are not remembered by how loud they spoke," Modi said, "but by how deeply they touched hearts. Last night I saw a leader not in his titles, not in his power, but in his humility, and I stand with that truth." Applause erupted, not wild, not forced, but rising like a wave that no one could stop. The hall filled with it, the sound echoing through every corner. People stood, some slowly, some quickly, until the whole room was on its feet. Not for dominance, not for pride, but for respect. Sundar stood still, his eyes lowered, his heart heavy with emotion. He had not expected this. He had not spoken to win applause. He had spoken to stay true. But now, as the sound of respect surrounded him, he felt tears press gently behind his eyes. In that moment, Sundar realized that humility had not only changed him, it had changed the room, and perhaps in small ways, it could change the world too. The echo that remained. The applause finally faded, but the feeling it carried did not. The hall that had once been heavy with tension was now filled with something softer, something deeper. It was not just respect for Sundar, it was reflection within every person sitting there. When the gathering ended, leaders began leaving in groups, but the conversations were different now. No one spoke only of strategies or numbers. Instead, they whispered about humility, about the way insult had been answered, about how one moment of calmness had shifted the atmosphere of an entire hall. Sundar walked slowly toward the exit. Arvind Krishna walked beside him, his face as calm as ever. Narendra followed closely, his expression unreadable, yet his eyes held a quiet respect. None of them spoke at first. There was no need. The silence itself was heavy with meaning. Outside, the evening air wrapped around them. Reporters waited, cameras ready, questions sharp on their tongues. They shouted Sundar's name, demanding statements, demanding responses. For a moment, Sundar hesitated. Old habits told him to prepare careful answers, to defend his choices, to make sure no one misunderstood his strength. But then, as the cameras flashed, he remembered Arvind's words again. We are not shaped by insult. We are shaped by how we choose to respond. He looked at the crowd of reporters and spoke with the same calm voice he had found in the hall. The world is full of voices, he said. Some are sharp, some are heavy, some try to hurt. But we cannot control the voices. We can only control the echoes we choose to leave behind. I choose to leave behind an echo of respect. The words were simple, but the silence that followed told him they had landed where they needed to. No argument, no defense, just truth. Later that night, Sundar sat alone in his room once more, but he was not restless as before. He felt lighter, as if a burden he had carried for years had finally been set down. He realized that the journey was not over. It never truly would be. Insults would come again, challenges would rise again, but now he understood that his strength was not in proving, not in winning, but in choosing. He thought about Arvind, about the moment when humility had silenced pride. He thought about Modi, about the words of respect spoken so unexpectedly. And most of all, he thought about the quiet shift inside himself. For years, he had believed that calmness was his shield. But now he saw it differently. Calmness was not a shield. It was a bridge. It connected him to others. It turned conflict into reflection. It turned insult into respect. The world outside moved on, as it always does. But those who had sat in that hall carried something new within them. Some would forget quickly, but some would carry it for life. And Sundar knew that even if only one heart had been changed, it was worth everything. As he closed his eyes, he whispered to himself, "True power is not in how high we rise, but in how gently we lift others, even when they try to push us down." And in that whisper, he found peace.